You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 7th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
there is a sense between restoring security, but we can't also ignore there was a strong sense of avenging and revenging what happened there. Then when Hezbollah joined, it opened another front.
A year since Hamas attacked Israel, we look back at 12 brutal months and examine how close it has brought the Middle East to full regional conflict. Also coming up, Tunisia's president is on course to win another term in office, with the polls marred by accusations that they're rigged and candidates are barred from standing. We'll ask what happened to the country which gave us the Arab Spring. Plus,
American elections always captivate the rest of the world because America does it bigger, better, longer, more colourful characters. But this one really has had so much drama that I wonder if there's any country in the world that has not been fairly mesmerised by what's happening here.
Covering the US election, we hear from the veteran correspondent Katty Kay of the fresh challenges of this year's presidential race. We'll follow South Korea's president on his trip around Southeast Asia, and we'll look at Monday's papers too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned the French President Emmanuel Macron that placing restrictions on Israel will just serve Iran and its proxies. The Netherlands are to invest up to €400 million to develop drones with Ukraine and to supply Kyiv with more F-16 fighter jets. And the mayor of the capital of Mexico's state of Guerrero has been killed less than a week since he took office. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, it is a year since Hamas fighters tore through Israel's border defences and mounted an attack that forever changed the Middle East. About 1,200 people were killed that day, thousands were injured, and another 250 abducted to the Gaza Strip. Since then, Palestinian authorities estimate that in the ensuing devastation in Gaza, more than 41,500 people, the majority women and children, have died. We are a long way from knowing what the final consequences will be. And in a moment, we'll hear from the Palestinian journalist Abeya Ayoub, who spent much of the last year in Gaza. But first, a little earlier, I was joined by Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House here in London. He's just come back from a trip to Israel, including visiting a kibbutz that Hamas attacked. I began by asking him to wind back the clock, not to October the 7th, but to the days immediately before.
It's been a long year, and, casting our mind back to 6th of October, we lived in a different world. And Netanyahu, in many ways, built his political career and credibility as one that defends Israel, but mainly against Iran. Iran building its nuclear program, potentially nuclear weapons, against its proxies in the region, especially the Hezbollah. And in addition, his main mission was to prevent the two-state solution. Now, Netanyahu, of course, was embroiled also and still embroiled in a corruption trial. So all was mixed into one, the way he formed his sixth government in December of 2023, which is a very far-right government with almost no breaks when it comes to either foreign policy or expansion of settlements. And the idea of funneling money through Qatar into the coffers of Hamas is to maintain the division between the West Bank and Gaza, between the PA, Fatah, and Hamas in Gaza, in order to avert any chance of a peace agreement based on a two-state solution. All of this collapsed within less than an hour on the 7th of October.
You recently returned from Israel and you visited one of the kibbutzes that had been the scene of slaughter. What was it like seeing something that we had witnessed across the world, but to actually experience it firsthand?
Shocking. I mean, you enter into kibbutz Nir Oz, And one of the members of the kibbutz, Nir Metzger, that his father was kidnapped and killed in Gaza. His mother also was kidnapped, but returned part of the first exchange of prisoners for hostages. And he told this heroic effort. He tried to protect his family, but only 6 houses in this kibbutz are still intact. Most of them are burned, destroyed. They even used gas cylinders, the gas cylinders that they use for cooking and for heating. In this, the Hamas militants used them to burn their houses. But they are back working in the fields there. And the interesting thing, Nir, that showed us the place when we asked him, so what do you think the future holds? He said, I still believe in a 2-state solution, but as long as we are safe here.
Tell me now about how Israel is feeling 1 year on, knowing that there is conflict and destruction happening on a daily basis, not just next door, but Israel very much feeling under siege in many ways. And the effect on communities and people whose lives have been profoundly changed by what is happening in Gaza, not least because lots of people are having to abandon what they are doing and take part.
I think, as you would expect, there is a whirlwind of feelings and contradiction and paradoxes, because on the one hand there was real anger after October 7. Even the more kind of peace-minded, people that were ready to make concession for peace, many of them lost empathy. The narrative that basically all Gazan people are to blame because some of the civilians joined in. And at the same time that Israel needs to protect itself and maybe there is no chance for peace. At the same time, blaming the government for not defending Israel, to building all this false perception that the border was safe because there was such a sophisticated fence there. So all of this collapsed basically within less than an hour. There is a sense between restoring security, but we can't also ignore there was a strong sense of avenging and revenging what happened there. Then when Hezbollah joined, it opened another front, many on a lower intensity, nevertheless a front that displaced 60,000 people.
Where does Israel stand now in the eyes of the world, and where do Israelis stand?
I think it's interesting to see that Israel, and when you speak to people also in position of power, so we don't really mind what the world think about us. We are fighting for our survival. Even when, for instance, the UK decided to withdraw 10% of the licenses of supplying weapons, the reaction for this was, or the overreaction, you stop us from winning. This is the kind of the mood, definitely within the government. Regardless, the fact that actually the United States and the UK and many others come to Israel and Germany, of course, supply nearly 100% of the weapons and suspended very little of that. And the United States, since most of the time, vetoes UN Security Council resolution on a ceasefire. But the mood is very much, let us win. But also there are questions of the government. Now, the reaction internationally, a lot of it, I must admit, was very unwelcome, not helping. What we need to move is actually people that support both communities, the Israelis and the Palestinians, to end this tragic phase, come to ceasefire, return of the hostages, rebuilding Gaza, and go back to the negotiation table and discuss seriously a model of two-state solution that fits the 21st century with all the changes that happened since Oslo. And I haven't seen enough of this constructive debate so far.
That was Yossi Meckelberg talking to me a little earlier on. Well, joining me now for reflections from Gaza is the Palestinian journalist Abaya Ayoub. She joins us from Istanbul, though she spent much of the last year in Gaza herself. A very good morning to you, Abaya.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
We are now, 1 year on. Did anyone possibly, or could anyone have envisaged the scale of what would happen afterwards, and indeed that it would last this long?
Not really. I don't think even those who planned for the October 7th attack imagined that the Israeli reaction would be this severe, and that it would take 1 year, and that it will change actually the scene in Gaza. Now we have Israeli military presence in both in the north and the south. We still have fighting between Hamas militants and Israel until the moment. We have more than a million Palestinians displaced in the south, and the ceasefire agreement is not happening anytime soon. We witnessed wars before in Gaza, and people thought that the 2014, 2008 were major wars before this happened, and before we became witnessing a real war with the meaning, the real meaning of the word.
Tell us a little bit more about what people's views in Gaza are of Hamas now. Has the devastation that people have suffered turned people against Hamas, or has it bred a new generation of fighters?
I would say both. That you have different views among the more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. You have people who are angry because they thought that Gaza was witnessing a time before October the 7th when Gaza was developing. It had a lot of new services. I visited Gaza before the war. I saw resorts. I saw people coping with the blockade. I saw that it was not a possibility that a new war would happen, because it seemed that Gaza is like businesses are developing, people are getting more familiar with the situation. And also when you talk about 41,000 being killed, these people have relatives, have children, and I can imagine that also this war brought a new generation of people who maybe were not engaged in the political scene, but now they are angry. And I mean, I assume that this war would lead to more escalations in the coming years, and more people, are more ready to be fighting against Israel.
You see this unfolding already, don't we? We see a multi-front conflict. We have the regional allies of Hamas now unfolding against Israel. We have Israel's invasion of Lebanon. We have Iran's bombardment of Israel. We have fresh bombing of Beirut overnight. But at the end of the day, the core of this whole conflict does remain in Gaza, the original battle between Hamas and Israel. The difficulty that we face now is that Hamas insist on a permanent ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu and his government insist on a temporary one, and that has prevented any truce, hasn't it?
Exactly. The demands of both sides are not on the same page. Israel wants to guarantee that a similar attack won't happen. They want to have a military presence in Gaza, which means that they can stop such attack from happening. And Hamas, of course, would not accept the war to end with having Israeli soldiers inside Gaza, in the Philadelphia corridor, and in Netzarim. It would not accept that 1 million Palestinians in the south are displaced and forced out of their homes, because this, of course, means a defeat for Hamas. Like before the war, there was no Israeli military presence in Gaza. There were no displaced people. And if the war ends this way, it definitely means that Hamas was defeated. Netanyahu also doesn't want the war to end with this picture of a defeated man, especially that until now, he and his government failed to get the Israeli hostages out by the war. Like it was less than 10 Israeli hostages who were released. Some of them were released after they were killed. And this is not why Bibi started the war. He started the war because he wanted to defeat Hamas, one, and to free all hostages. None of that happened, even after 1 year of the war. And as I said, Hamas would not accept that the war would end with angry people because their lives were turned upside down.
Abir Ayoub, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. 8:14 a.m. in Paris, 7:14 in Tunis. Now, some 13 years since Tunisia was lauded as the birthplace of the Arab Spring, the country went to vote this weekend in what was widely expected to be a rigged election. Opponents to the incumbent, Kais Saied, say they've been at best barred from running, at worst thrown into jail. Well, as it stands, Saied is currently on course to win the election by a landslide. And to bring us up to date, I'm joined now by Tarek Megharisi, who's Senior Policy Fellow with the North Africa and Middle East Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good morning, Tarek.
Good morning.
So what do we know about the results?
Well, we know what the incumbent presidency is claiming to be the results. So far, an exit poll by a strange, previously unknown company is claiming that the president has an 89% vote share. From some of the exit polls, but the official announcement has been postponed until 7:30 today, so we will see if he will get even more popular over time.
The one thing that we do have a sense of is the turnout, and it's low. It's under 28%, isn't it?
Yeah, the estimations are somewhere between 25 to 30%, which is low, but not as embarrassingly low as the 11% turnout last year for the parliamentary elections.
So just tell us a little bit more about how we have got here. What's the background? We have Kais Saied now very much on course to win another term in office. But we mentioned at the beginning of this item that it's 2011 when we had the Arab Spring, when we had a natural and vibrant rise in democracy. So where did it go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, Tunisia's return to authoritarianism started gradually and then became very sudden. People over the 10 years since 2011, they grew increasingly frustrated because they saw their interior ministry, their police is still being very harsh. People hadn't quite developed the democratic rights they were promised, and the economy was in the doldrums for extended periods. Saied came in a familiar mold of somebody who promised to restore decisive leadership and restore Tunisian democracy. And all he's done since seizing absolute power in 2021 is to centralize it ever more into his hands. And so we've seen, this is the first Tunisian elections in over 10 years now that are not free and fair. But it doesn't mean that, he's destined to become a lifetime dictator. I think President Saied sums up the phrase, a weak strongman. He has no constituency of his own. He has no political party of his own. He's systematically warring across the entire Tunisian state. And as we can see with the response to to these announcements that he has won 89%, which is not even outrage, but ridicule, I think he's going to re-enter office now as a very weak individual, which unfortunately does not bode well for Tunisia, which is already in dire straits from his leadership.
We see, though, that any opposition that is mounted towards his campaign is swiftly cut down. So you say that he goes back into power weakened, but there is no one against him. Isn't the main opposition leader in prison?
Yes, and there were other exit polls, though, just as dubious that actually put his main opposition, Ayashi Zemal, at 50% or just over 50% of the vote. So it is genuinely questionable what the electorate thought. But yes, while his political opposition are in jail, the street is growing ever more disgruntled against him. I mean, we saw huge protests in the build-up to this election that were very reminiscent of 2011. Ultimately, Said's power and authority is dependent on the security services and the military, which if rumors are to be believed, are increasingly suspect over him and his rule, because he is bringing instability to the country through these prolonged protests and through economic mismanagement. So despite his opposition being locked up, it seems that he still doesn't have too much of a platform to stabilize himself on.
What about on the international front, when we have a relationship with the European Union, which has come under the spotlight in the last couple of years, especially with agreements being made for Tunisia to get funding from the European Union in order to manage the flow of migrants and refugees? There are horror stories about what is happening in Tunisia at the moment and questions being raised about the way that this is all being run. Nonetheless, it means that Tunisia and Said is an important figure when it comes to international relations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, President Said has, or his interior ministry have very cleverly maneuvered themselves as a group of people who are very important to the Italians, to the Europeans, as being Europe's border guard, so to speak, despite Said's public pronouncements that he would not reduce Tunisia to being a border guard. Over the last year, since this memorandum of understanding was signed with the EU, arrivals in Italy from Tunisia have dropped over 50%. And these were done through horrific practices. You know, they are essentially rounding up not just migrants, but Black people and leaving them in the desert to die. And so the Europeans see this as, you know, somebody who is reducing migration appropriately, which is why we haven't seen the kind of pushback that you would usually expect from Europe towards a democratic country in its neighborhood that is backsliding so horrendously. Unfortunately, the Europeans are plagued by a migration myopia and the imperatives of the short term, and so. Yes, unfortunately, Said has very expertly used the migration issue to leverage himself into a position of importance.
Tarek Meghouzi, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
We have proven to be a prize that is truly artist-driven, that truly supports artists both in their production and in their career development.
The Future Generation Art Prize celebrates its 15th anniversary. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:23 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, I am delighted to say, is Inga Thorda, Chief External Relations Officer at the Oceanborn Foundation. But before that, former senior editor at both the BBC and CNN. Good morning, Inga. Welcome.
Thank you, Emma. It's lovely to be here with you.
How's life in the Thorda world?
Oh, it's very good. Thank you. So I've moved from news to the climate, which is an interesting shift given that both of them are quite bleak today.
OK, fine. Well, we'll try and find something warm and loving in the next few hours. Let's start off, though, with the coverage of a very British scandal. Sue Gray. Now, for those of us who remember Sue Gray, her name was quite important in the aftermath of the pandemic because it was her report which determined how much they had been misbehaving behind closed doors at Downing Street. She was then brought in as a senior figure in the new Labour government. She's out. What's happened? What's gone wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going wrong for the Labour government here in the UK right now. So Sue Gray has been in the spotlight now for a couple of weeks, I would say. First of all, for, her salary being higher than the Prime Minister's, and then basically becoming the news. And, this sort of old adage that, if the spokesperson needs a spokesperson, it's probably time to go. Now, so she resigned yesterday, although the right-wing papers here, of course, saying that she was ousted, and that sort of left-wing, right-wing narrative is very alive this morning as in the papers. But as you sort of alluded to, Sue Gray obviously was the sort of head of the investigation into Partygate, which was one of the reasons that Boris Johnson then had to really resign. She then made this shift from a civil servant into politics, and now it sort of seems that, those who are more experienced in politics, like the person who's succeeding her, Morgan McSweeney, have kind of won the battle in number 10. And he comes in with a much more sort of political background and political experience. And so does the new head of strategic communications. They clearly found that, strengthening communications was important at this point.
This does seem to have been a problem indeed, regardless of the difficulties that the government has faced. In its first 100 days have been beset with self-inflicted wounds. But the way it has been communicated to the outside world seems to be as much of a part of the problem as anything else.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. They haven't sort of quite tackled it in a way that they probably should. And I mean, you allude to the 100 days. I mean, that's where we are. We're almost 100 days into this administration. And given the unbelievable sort of result of the election campaign, where they won such a decisive victory, you can almost say that they've squandered that goodwill with the nation in a very short period of time. And Keir Starmer now a very unpopular prime minister, you could say. I mean, the latest YouGov poll putting him at about 35%, which is quite extraordinary given the margins that he has in Parliament at the moment. But, I think this is also critical time for Keir Starmer. It comes just a few weeks before the first budget. He's going to have to pull some rabbits out of a hat here, I think, to get the public back on his side. So the communications team is going to be busy.
Let's move on to widespread coverage of the tropical storm Milton in Florida. Florida, a state still recovering from Helene, and now is under the spotlight again.
That's right. So Milton, he's a Category 1 storm at the moment, but is expected to strengthen to Category 3 or even Category 4 storm before it makes landfall midweek, most likely on Wednesday. Now, there's going to be areas in its path that have already been hit by Helene, or at least in the sort of will be affected by the sort of tail of Milton. Big cities also expected to be hit by heavy rainfalls: Miami, Orlando, Tampa. And so many of the areas that are still recovering and are still under state of emergency are going to be in its path. And they've now extended evacuation orders in Florida. More counties are under state of emergency. And it's really interesting. I heard a quote from a meteorologist the other day that he said that the Gulf of Mexico was basically laying down the red carpet for Milton, meaning, of course, that the warming oceans and the climate change means that, his path over that Gulf will strengthen it even more than it would have maybe a few decades ago.
It's an interesting situation because immediately officials are having to get ready to evacuate more people from their homes, to just to make sure that the impact of Milton is not as great as it could be. Nonetheless, for a long time now, we've been talking about places like Florida, which have become safe havens for ex-New Yorkers who've decided that they don't want to live in New York anymore because they think it's a bit grotty, so they'll come down to Florida. And there is a huge amount of development and there's a huge amount of money being pushed into Florida. It's a great destination for people to move to. Nonetheless, nature always wins this game, doesn't it?
Well, yes. And I mean, partly because adaptation efforts have been lacking. And frankly, hurricane seasons are much stronger than they used to be. They last longer. The hurricanes are closer together. So, and I mean, this can all be, put down to our changing climate in a way. And I mean, if we're very much focused on Florida at the moment, as you say, that used to be this great place that people went for sunshine and sea. And now it's becoming actually probably very problematic for people who live there for these reasons. But I think it's worth mentioning that there are two other hurricanes out there. One of it is going to affect Britain most likely later this week. This is Kirk, and then we've got Leslie out in the Atlantic as well. So, the strength of the hurricane seasons is quite incredible this year.
I wish they would give them slightly scarier names. I'm not entirely sure how scared I can be of something called Kirk. Let's move to an absolute opposite. With your climate and environmental hat on, you've drawn our attention to an excellent long read in the New York Times about the Amazon having exactly the opposite problem from Florida.
Yeah, and I think this is the sort of interesting thing is that, when you think about the sort of climate that, you can have these unbelievable extremes and not that far apart. I mean, we're still in the same continent. But yes, the problems in the Amazon is drought. And what that is sort of causing is that both the Amazon itself and its tributary rivers are at a record low water level, and that's the lowest for about 120 years. Now, what's the interesting thing in the New York Times is saying is that what the Brazilian government is planning to do is dredge the river. Now, this has only been done in very extreme cases in the past. And dredging the river, of course, means making it deeper, taking sediment from one place and moving it to another. And that can help with transportation, which is a huge problem right now in the Amazon region, both indigenous people being stranded, also goods not making its way. And there's a local election coming up, and they think that people won't even be able to vote. So they're going to have to move the machines with flying voting machines over to those areas. But I think that what we have to think about that every time that we do these interventions like dredging, there is a danger. And scientists have warned of the lasting mark on the aquatic system that comes with that, both on plants and on animals, but also unearthing deposits of mercury, which is basically dangerous for people. Although that there is a need for some intervention to be done, that can also have consequences. And I think that's the kind of what I took from that article more than anything.
Finally, let's have an abrupt gear change in terms of subject matter. Shopping on remote Scottish islands have become an enormously problematic subject.
Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it? Those of us who live in big cities where everything is open almost 24/7. But no, the residents of the island of Lewis are very torn over whether Tesco, one of the big supermarkets, should be allowed to open on Sundays. It's opened a consultation. 700 people have already signed a petition saying they do not want their Sundays to be disturbed by shopping. And I mean, this comes partly because residents, many of them are members of the Protestant denomination and believe that Sunday should be kept holy. And Tesco is, however, confident that it can find the balance. I don't know. I think it's a difficult one, Emma. I mean, should we all be relaxing on a Sunday, or is it a time when we catch up on our shopping?
And that's when we actually go and do what we couldn't do during the week. But what I love about the fact is the absolute approach that these islanders have taken. This article talks about how in the past, park swings were chained up at dusk on a Saturday, and hanging out washing on a Sunday was considered not the done thing. That idea that people still adhere to a few principles is possibly something that we could learn a little from.
I think so. I don't think it's such a bad idea. And I think that this sort of argument that one day a week, is it not a good time to rest, to spend time with your family, maybe not sort of step out of the sort of treadmill for a little while. I mean, I think it's an interesting debate, and I'm glad that it's sort of getting tension outside of Scotland. I think we all need a bit of a moment of reflection sometimes about how we spend our time.
Inga Thorda, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is just nudging 7:33 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at what else we're following today. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned the French President Emmanuel Macron that placing restrictions on Israel will just serve Iran and its proxies. In a phone call between the two leaders, Mr. Netanyahu said just as Iran supports all parts of the Iranian terror axis, so are Israel's friends expected to support it. Mr. Macron had said this weekend that shipments of arms to Israel used in the war in Gaza should be stopped as part of a broader effort to find a political solution to the conflict. The Netherlands are to invest up to €400 million to develop drones with Ukraine and to supply Kyiv with more F-16 fighter jets. In a surprise visit to Ukraine, the Dutch Defence Minister said around half of the investment will be spent in the Netherlands, while the rest will be split between Ukraine and other countries. And the mayor of the capital of Mexico's state of Guerrero has been killed less than a week after he took office. Alejandro Arcos was killed just 6 days after he took office as mayor of the city of Chilpancingo. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, with traditional news reporting changing fast, many trusted journalists are holding firm despite the deep disruption brought by the internet. In Monocle's October edition of the magazine, Thomas Lewis sat down with Katty Kay, US special correspondent for the BBC and host of The Rest is Politics US, to find out how she'll be covering the election and what makes it such an interesting moment for reporters.
I mean, I think it's almost hard for me to think of the number of ways in which this election campaign has been exceptional, because there are so many firsts, aren't there? It's the first time that we have a president obviously dropping out this close to an election. And so we've got an almost UK style election that is compressed in size and time length. It's not UK style in terms of money, of course. I think Kamala Harris manages to raise in about one day what is spent on the entire election season back in the UK. So it's not totally British, but for Americans, I think it's, it is extraordinary to see that you can hold presidential election in the space of just 4 months. So there's the whole drama around Joe Biden and his age, and then the debate performance and him dropping out and who was going to get in and the way that was orchestrated. So it's been a kind of incredibly dramatic news cycle. Then, of course, former President Trump getting shot at and nearly assassinated. I mean, I, even as I list these things that I'm almost now forgetting because they come so fast, one on top of the other, but I have to I ought to keep them written down on a piece of paper, Thomas, so that I remember the number of ways in which this election cycle has been extraordinary. And then, of course, you've got Donald Trump, who, again, very, very unusual, lost his bid for re-election and is now come back again to try and get elected again. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that Donald Trump is always a pretty exceptional candidate in and of himself. So, and another first, you've got the first Black Asian American woman running to be president of the United States with, at the moment, you have to give her a pretty even odds-on even chance of getting elected. So, I mean, it's just, I feel like I could go on in the ways in which this is exceptional. And so I think this has been an election that has, every election captivates the world. American elections always captivate the rest of the world because America does it bigger, better, longer, more colorful characters, more expensive. I mean, everything is over the top. The debates are over the top compared to British elections. The conventions are over the top compared to party conferences. But this one really has had so much drama that I wonder if there's any country in the world that has not been fairly mesmerized by what's happening here.
And do you think then, Katty, that the fact that there is so relatively, anyway, little time to go, therefore, before election day, that sort of sense of enthusiasm that seems to be dominating so much around Kamala Harris at the moment, actually, because I suppose usually you wonder how long this kind of enthusiasm, joy can kind of actually sustain itself, and when the sort of hard reality of policies and that kind of scrutiny sort of comes into play. Do you think, therefore, a shorter election period with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket will maybe work in her favour, or do you think that the honeymoon might run out before election day, and maybe how that might play for the Democratic campaign?
Look, I think she's already benefited from this being a short election campaign. And one way that she's benefited is because she didn't have to go through a primary race. And I think that actually, in retrospect, particularly for a woman of color who is a first, a kind of double first, if you like, not having to go through the US primary system in retrospect is super helpful, because when you have a woman up against a man, you're asking voters to vote for something they've never had before. You're asking them to imagine something that up until now has been impossible. And a lot of primary voters might say, I really like Kamala Harris, but I don't know, will my neighbor vote for a woman? Will my neighbor vote for a black woman? Will middle America vote for a black woman? And they'll kind of talk themselves into thinking this is impossible. And this is what the process that Hillary Clinton has described so eloquently. And in a way, Kamala Harris benefited from the fact there was no primary. She got presented as the solution to the Democrats' problems, and primary voters didn't have to ask themselves if they felt confident that she could win. She is what they have now. On the kind of scrutiny that she's going to have to go through on the policy side, look, we're going to see some of that in September when she goes into a 90-minute debate against Donald Trump. And you're quite right that up until now, there hasn't been much policy. There have been no tough one-on-one media interviews. It's all been pretty friendly. It's all been pretty sort of surface, if you like. She outlaid one policy position on this kind of set of policy positions on the economy. And already that came under some quite quick scrutiny, including from Democrats. So she knows that once you put policy out there in black and white, yes, it is going to be attacked both from Republicans and maybe even from some Democrats. So she's going to have to answer some of those policy questions, but there's certainly a lot less time for those hits to come. Now, the sort of counterpoint to that is, were she to be knocked sideways by something, by some revelation or by some poor performance or by some poor set of policy papers, there's less time to recover from it. So I suppose from her point of view, better to get kind of the knocks out of the way sooner rather than later so that she has longer to recover.
Thomas Lewis talking to Katty Kay there. You can read the full interview in October's edition of our magazine, available on newsstands now. You're with Monocle Radio. 15:40 in Seoul, which is where we head now, because the president of South Korea is on tour. He's going around Southeast Asia this week, taking in the likes of the Philippines and Singapore ahead of the ASEAN summit in Laos. Well, following Yoon Suk Yeol's travels is John Lee, editor of Korea Pro. He joins me from Seoul now. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Just explain to us, why is he choosing to go on tour now?
Well, right now, the most important thing that's going on in the region is the ASEAN summit, along with the ASEAN Plus 3 summit that was happening in Laos. And that's going to be the final leg of his journey. So prior to actually arriving in Laos, the president is hoping to actually get some sorts of trade agreements with the Philippines and Singapore. Particularly when it comes to Singapore, the president is looking to expand arms sales and potentially, and this is a very big potentially, a nuclear power plant export.
This is the Philippines in particular, wanting to make sure that it can develop its nuclear reactors to meet its carbon reduction goals. What do the Philippines and South Korea stand to gain from this?
Well, we have to remember, when it comes to nuclear power, we're not quite sure how much progress that President Marcos is going to be able to make. The country's nuclear power project has been mothballed since the 1980s. Now, obviously, South Korea has a lot to gain if the Philippines is able to manage to restart this program. But especially when it comes to nuclear power, the biggest thing on everyone's mind is, as you just mentioned, trying to reduce carbon emissions.
So tell us also other things that the South Koreans are after when it comes to meeting the likes of the Philippines. We'll move on to Singapore in a moment, because he's having a 3-day visit there. But there are critical minerals, and Philippines is an interesting place to invest at the moment if you are South Korea. What can Seoul be gaining from the Philippines' natural resources?
When it comes to natural resources, the two things that really stand out are nickel and cobalt. And these are the two elements that are really needed for electric vehicle battery manufacturing. Now, as anyone who's paid attention will know, China has the biggest market share in all of this. And South Korea is really trying to diversify its supply chains away from China as much as possible. Now, it will still not nearly be as enough as, say, what Washington would like for South Korea to do. But it is trying to diversify to, say, Australia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Chile.
Let's move on to the president's 3-day visit to Singapore. We've talked about natural minerals in Philippines. Now, the focus in Singapore is what? It's more technology and innovation, isn't it?
Yes. When it comes to Singapore, obviously Singapore doesn't have a lot of natural resources to export, but Singapore is a digital powerhouse, digital being the key word. Now, as some of your listeners might be aware, Singapore is one of the 3 original founding members of DEPA, the Digital Trade Pact. And South Korea became a member in May. And now that South Korea is a member of DEPA, it is going to be able to try to, and it's also a member of the group now, South Korea is trying to be able to dictate terms and become part of the overall larger partner in that organization.
John Lee, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're with Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
.45 here in London. Let's talk arts and culture now. The journalist Gabe Bullard joins me on the line now from Basel. A very good morning to you, Gabe. How's Basel looking today?
Looking great. A little rainy, but otherwise great.
Still wonderful. OK, let's crack on with what we've got to get through in terms of arts news. You want to talk about podcasts and politics?
Yes. So over the weekend, this episode of the very popular sex and comedy podcast, Call Her Daddy, dropped with Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for the presidency, doing the interview. And this is part of the Harris media strategy, appearing on podcasts like this. She was on the popular sports podcast, All the Smoke. She's talking to Howard Stern, not a podcaster, but still, long form audio personality there. And she has a few more traditional media appearances. The 60 Minutes interview is out. She's going on The Late Show with Colbert, that sort of thing. But it is interesting to see a presidential candidate paying this much attention to podcasts in the campaign.
And is there a sense that this might actually have some effect on the electorate?
I think so. It seems like it's a strategy to go after younger voters, to go after voters who might not be that plugged into politics, who might not be, looking at their local newspaper, listening to news programs on the radio, or even to newsier podcasts. So it does seem like it is a play to reach some of these audiences who would otherwise be tuned out, maybe not vote, or who were maybe uncertain and weren't quite sure where to go. And I think this is going to be an election, like all elections, that's down to turnout. How many people can the Democrats get out if they're hoping to defeat Donald Trump? And, it seems like a pretty strong play to go after these shows that have a very strong under 30 audience.
There's a risk, though, when you appear on a podcast, is that you think that it's not proper radio, that you believe that actually, because it's just one single-centred subject, that what you say doesn't count. That's not the case, is it?
No. I think it's really a sign of just how much the media has changed, that it's so much more fragmented now. Trust in the U.S. in sort of the mainstream traditional news media is very, very low. And a lot of listeners have formed these very different relationships with podcast hosts, those parasocial relationships, which existed in radio, but I think it's a little bit different in the podcast realm, that people really feel like they are friends with these hosts, that they have this strong connection. They feel that personality. I don't think they see them necessarily as journalistic, but I think when they hear a guest on a podcast, they do think of it as a conversation that's going to be worth their time because it's happening with somebody who they feel a connection to and somebody who that person certainly finds important enough to give, an hour of audio time to.
Let's move on to Francis Ford Coppola, a huge film coming out, Megalopolis, not doing quite as well at the box office, but is being reasonably well received, isn't it? It's a big moment in film.
It is. This was his passion project, more than $100 million self-financed to put this film together. It is doing quite poorly at the box office. I don't think that it was necessarily seen as this, commercial enterprise necessarily. It is really on the screen. You see that it is a passion project, that it is, him trying to tell a story that he wants to tell in the way he wants to tell it. But what really strikes me is, for as poor as it's doing in theaters, it is everywhere online. And I know these are algorithmically driven networks, but every time I'm on social media, whether it's Letterboxd or whether it's Instagram, I am seeing so many people talking about Megalopolis, showing clips of it, usually as jokes. But it's going to be really interesting to see how much this ends up driving the reputation of the movie, or even maybe future ticket sales, if people keep seeing, clips of Adam Driver and wondering what is going on in this movie, and maybe decide that they have to go to the theater and see it.
It's interesting because, as you say, clips and the jokes are actually reaching more people than those who are genuinely going to the cinema to watch the film in its entirety.
Yeah, looking at the box office numbers and looking at what you see in terms of reactions to these clips and comments, it really does seem like those have reached way more people, which I have to say is kind of a shame, because out of context, it doesn't really make any sense. It is something just to kind of, maybe chuckle at or breeze by. And within the context of the movie, these clips play very, very differently. But, hopefully maybe people will realize, well, I need the context. Although, who knows this day and age, how many people are really seeking that deeper context.
Let's move to Asheville. Hurricane Helene has damaged a huge amount of the buildings, most notably in the town's arts district. I mean, Monocle, we were out there last April, I believe, exploring a really exciting and vibrant city. How hard has it been hit by the hurricane?
It is devastated. That is the word that you see all the time. I was just looking at some of the latest photos to come out. It's estimated some 80% of buildings in that River Arts District have been damaged somehow. They've taken on water, and there's reports of pieces of art floating along with the debris. And, you know, the entire region is in need of relief, of course. But as you mentioned, that Arts District is really bringing a vibrancy to the area. It's been so long in the making and is one of the top tourist destinations. It's a place where people aspire to go, whether they're working artists or whether they're just appreciators. There's workshops. It's really an example of how a community of artists can work with the community at large. And to see it so devastated, I think raises a lot of questions of how can they rebuild and how can Asheville sort of reestablish this reputation as an arts district.
Well, very briefly, what needs to be done?
I think that we're going to see, you know, we'll see what the relief efforts look like, what relief might there be to rebuild these galleries. But I think that's the point right now is rebuild, and make sure that artists are able to recover what they can recover and to get back into their spaces and to still have this place where artists outside of some of the big commercial hubs can operate and engage with their community.
Kay Bullard, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Finally, the Future Generation Art Prize is celebrating its 15th anniversary this year. Bjorn Gelthoff is the artistic director of the PinchukArtCentre in Kyiv, an important cultural institution in Ukraine's art scene. It's become a staunch international advocate of Ukrainian art since the start of the war. Monocle's Georgina Godwin sat down with Bjorn to find out more about the prize.
The Future Generation Art Prize is one of the most important prizes for artists up to 35 years of age. Anywhere in the world. It's a prize that is completely democratic, where any artist can apply. And then we select 20 shortlisted artists who, together with the winner of the PinchukArtCentre prize, form a group of 21 who then make an exhibition in the PinchukArtCentre. They compete for an amount of $100,000, which is then awarded by a very renowned jury. This year alone, we had more than 12,000 applications from all over the world for the prize.
Why is the prize seen as so important?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's the only prize in the world that is fully and truly democratic. There is no pre-selection process. Anybody can really apply. And secondly, with a very long history, we started the prize in 2009, we have proven to be a prize that is truly artist-driven, that truly supports artists both in their production and in their career development. And that has been noticed by many artists around. Communities have formed with every prize, and I think that has given the prize really wings.
Bjorn, what is the role of art in conflict?
In Kyiv specifically, where we have reopened the PinchukArtCentre in June 2022, shortly after the area around Kyiv was liberated and Kyiv itself was no longer under physical threat of an invasion itself, we have discovered that art really gives oxygen to society. It's incredibly important for people to live beyond the continuous threat of what is going on. And through art, we have a tool and a medium that allows them to think about other things, to feel, but also to address the war and to address it in a less direct form. So we have noticed that our audience is radically new. Many people left Ukraine, of course, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And once that we reopened, we discovered that 80% of our audience never came to a museum before. So looking for culture seems to be one of the very important aspects for many people in Ukraine. We have now an audience of around 1,400 people every day.
That's extraordinary. Older artists have worked before the war. They remember other inspirations. I wonder how the work of the younger generation, who've never known anything but war, how that work is influenced by the events on the ground. I mean, are you seeing, for instance, much darker work?
Well, we can luckily say that none of the artists that are working right now have never seen anything but war. The war is ongoing for 10 years when we count the start in Donbass, but obviously it's only ongoing for more than 2 years now. in the entirety of Ukraine. But what we have seen is a shift of work. I think many artists have stepped forward and decided also to speak about the war or to let the war influence their work simply because it's the context in which they live. But what I'm very happy to say is that very few of them have allowed it to change their work so dramatically that they become mouthpieces of, for example, government position or something like that. They remain very critical. They remain considerate and reflective. But the work itself has, of course, changed. It's impossible that the work wouldn't change because your context has so dramatically changed in which you work.
Tell us about the exhibition which opens at the end of the month.
So the exhibition will open slightly later because we have had relatively large problems with electricity after a few large-scale aerial attacks from the Russians. So now we have to build an external generator that feeds the entire art center, but we are confident we will open a few weeks after the initial date. And what we will have there is the 21 artists who were shortlisted in the prize. For us, it's a very exciting moment because we have artists coming to Ukraine from all over the world, producing new work for Ukraine and for Kyiv specifically and the PinchukArtCentre specifically. And I believe that's something that Ukrainians are waiting for, that commitment, that engagement, that risk-taking from artists who have, in a way, nothing to do with what is going on in Ukraine, to still come to Ukraine, to still engage with Ukrainians and to still show their work there, regardless the risk.
And finally, Bjorn, tell us a little bit more about the PinchukArtCentre.
The PinchukArtCentre has been founded in 2006. It's the largest contemporary arts institution in the country, and it's, of course, privately held.
Bjorn Geltoft in conversation with Georgina Godwin there. And the winner of the Future Generation Art Prize will be announced on the 29th of this month. And if you do happen to find yourself in Kyiv, the PinchukArtCentre will be displaying the art prize as well. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers Hassan Anderson, Tom Webb and Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Sana Jumani and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. Hope you can join me if you can for that. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great week.